I've been looking for a replacement for my headless WordPress site, but there's one big challenge. There's just way too many headless CMS options out there. So how do I know which one to choose from? Well, I think I found a pretty compelling option, where if you've ever heard of Hashnode, which is a content platform for devs, which allows you to write and publish your content on their site, they came out with a new solution called Headless Hashnode, where we can use their GraphQL APIs to query all of our content headlessly by turning on headless mode, which then allows us to pull all that data into our own website and build it really however we want. Where the best part about it is we can still feed that into the Hashnode network and get that promoted content, whether it's in their feed or wherever they promote the content. So we're going to see how we can do that inside of a Next.js app using the app router. This video is sponsored by Hashnode, so make sure you head over to hashnode.com and join their community of other developer writers. So I'm going to start off in a new Next.js application where I just prep some basic UI to make it a little bit easier to show our blogs as we pull them into our application. Now it's worth noting, if you want to just get bootstrapped with a new blog, you can check out their starter kits at the Headless Hashnode site, where if you search for the word starter or just scroll down, you can see that they have this starter kit available that gives you a comprehensive setup for being able to use Headless Hashnode. But I'm going to dive right into the application code, where if we can see inside the app directory, we have our page file, which is going to be our home page. And we can see I have an image here, I have a title, we have the new date, which is just currently dumping in the current date into the page. But then this is going to be where we're going to list out all of our different posts. Now, if we head over to the API docs, we can see all the different things that are available for us through this API, but including the actual endpoint that we're going to use, which is gql.hashnode.com. We can even see a link to where we can use a playground where we can kind of explore all the different queries, which we'll use in a second to actually build one of our queries out. But ultimately, we're going to need to query that API. And while there's a bunch of different GraphQL libraries out there, some with different ranges of app router support, we can just simply use the fetch API, and then we can tap into the Next.js caching mechanism, which we'll save for another video, which can give you a little bit more control over how those requests are actually cached. So the first thing I'm actually going to do is create a GraphQL client, which is basically just a reusable way for us to query the Hashnode API. So under my lib directory, I'm going to create a new file called hashnode.ts. And inside that file, I'm going to first export a new async function called query, where inside I'm going to create a new constant of data, which is equal to await fetch, where we're going to query that https://gql.hashnode.com, where again, you can find that link inside of the docs. But then we want to set a method of post, which is currently what Hashnode supports for its queries. I'm going to then set some headers, where I'm going to set a content type of application JSON. But then I'm going to ultimately create my body, which is going to be a JSON.stringified object, which is going to include two things. It's going to include my query and some variables. Now, of course, we need to actually set up those parameters that we're going to pass in as arguments. So inside of query, I'm going to set up those arguments of query and variables. And of course, we're going to need to type these out. So I'm going to create a new interface called query, where inside we have both our query and our variables, where our query itself is just going to be a string, but then we're going to have an object for our variables. So we can just make that object, but then we're going to make this optional, as not every query request actually needs variables in order to satisfy that request. So then I can take my query and I'm going to apply it as the type to those arguments. And the only other thing that I want to do is set up the mechanism for cache tags so that in the future we can figure out how we can actually refresh that cache or revalidate that cache. So just to future prep us, I'm going to add the Next.js or next property here, where we're going to pass the tag straight through, which I can add as another argument as part of that destructured object, where this time this is going to be an array of string. But once this fetch request is actually made, I'm going to go ahead and then chain on a then, where I'm going to turn that into JSON. And of course, you can add some error handling here. We're not going to cover that right now, but then ultimately we can return that data. So now that we have this interface for actually querying the API, let's go ahead and use it. So we're going to head back over to the home page, where I'm going to import that query from at lib hashnode, where I have my aliases set up for this project. But then we're going to ultimately be able to query inside of our server component here, where I just want to make sure that that's an important designation, where we're going to currently work in server components instead of client components, meaning we're going to be able to make this fetch request right inside of our React component. So if we head over to the GraphQL playground, we can start to actually construct the query that we're going to use to get those posts. So if we look inside of the documentation explorer here, we can see everything that's available for us. Where, of course, what we want to start off with is our root query, where what we're going to actually look for is the publication. And if you look through this list, you should be able to find it, publication, where here is going to include all the information about the publication itself. But what we really want is the posts that relate to that publication. So we're going to start off by actually looking for that publication. But the thing that we want to do is make sure that we look for the right publication. So we're going to pass an argument into that, which is going to be the actual host of the publication. So to start off, we need to create a new argument for this query. Let's make it host, which is going to be a string. And then inside the publication itself, I can pass in that host as my variable. And then before I actually start filling that out, let's add our host variable, which looks like I already did, where I have an object where my host is spacejelly.hashnode.dev, which is my personal host. And then inside this, just to test it out, let's add title for the publication just to make sure that it's working. And if I go ahead and hide myself here and click play, we can see that I get that data back, which includes that publication and the title, which is Space Jelly. Now, what we actually want to query on here is the posts of the publication, the posts that relate to that publication. So what we can do is we can grab the posts here. But if we start to look at posts, let's get the definition here. We're going to need to pass in an argument. So what we can do is grab the first X or number amount of posts, where let's pass in first. I'm going to pass in, let's do 10, and then we can start to query the data under each of these posts, where let's grab things like title. We're actually inside of posts, we need to first do edges, our node, the little tooltip is hanging over, but then we can start to do things like title, a slug, our ID, and just to test this out, let's see if this is working. Let's hide myself again, and I'm going to click play. And we can see that, well, I don't have 10 posts in there currently. We can see that I get all the posts in there, including all that information that I queried. Now, as far as what we're going to need for our application, I'm only going to want two other things, and that's going to be the cover image for each of those posts and the publish date. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the cover image, which is going to include a URL that I want to query, and then the published at date, where again, let's query this. And we can see that along with all the information, we get our cover image and the URL, as well as that published at date. So I think we're at a good place with this particular query, where let's start copying this into our application. So I'm going to go ahead and copy all that. And inside my application, I'm going to start off by writing that new query, where let's say constant data is equal to await query. We're inside those arguments. Let's first add our query, which is going to be that query that we just constructed. And then we're going to want to pass in those variables as we added through those arguments, where our variable here is going to be our host, which in my instance is going to be spacejelly.hashnode.dev. So now let's actually console log this data out just to make sure that this is working properly and kind of see the data structure that we're getting for this. So if I open back up my website and I try to refresh, we can see in the data, and this is a little bit hard to see here, we see we get our data object, which includes a data property, a publication property inside that, and then finally our post, which is going to be an array of all of our different content. So let's actually try to grab that. So I'm going to do some extra destructuring here, where let's first grab that data. Inside that data, I'm going to grab that publication. And just to make it a little bit more convenient for us to work with, I'm going to grab this publication and I'm going to create a new constant called post, which will be equal to that publication, where I'm going to reference the posts and then the edges on that post. And I'm going to actually map through that. And instead of having to reference that node every time, I'm going to, again, just make it a little bit more convenient, where I'm going to take that node and I'm going to pass that right back. Now, the only thing that TypeScript isn't going to be happy with this, so we're going to actually have to type this out. So let me hide myself for a second. Let's add the type for this, where we're going to have node, and that's going to be a post, where we're going to write that up here now, where we're going to create that new interface. I'm going to add myself back here, where we have an interface of post. And what all are we going to query on this? Let's add all this stuff from our node above. And most of this is going to be a string. So I'm going to add my string for my title, my slug, my ID, my URL. Add my colon here for that object. And then for the publish date, I think that's going to be a string as well, and we can confirm that. But ultimately, I have my new type for my post, which is then going to be represented in that data. So again, let's console log this out just to make sure we're in a good spot. Again, if I refresh the page, we can now see that we have all of our nice structured data in here, including the title, slug, ID, cover image, and the published at for every single one of our blog posts. So let's actually start to list these out. Back inside of the app, if I scroll down to where I'm actually trying to show these posts, post, you can see here that I have this new list item for every post that I want to show. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say post.map, and for each of those posts, we can already see that we're getting a type error here. So what I can also do is I can say for this post that this is going to be an array of post, just to make sure that we are all type happy throughout this entire thing. But ultimately, I want to return this list item, which I'm going to cut out and paste inside of that return statement. And we can see that we have some Tailwind styles on here. I'm not really going to cover that, but it just gives us a nice starting place for how we can have some UI to show what's going on here. But then I can start to take this post data and actually add it everywhere. Where we have the title, let's add the post.title. I want to make sure I have a key on the list item, so post.id, which is always important for us. We want to make sure that we have the post published at date. And then for the image, let's go ahead and first I'm going to break this down for all these different props to make it a little bit more easier to read. But for the source of this, I want to make sure that this is going to be our dynamic value of post.coverimage.url. Now, an important thing to note here is when we're passing in this URL, we're passing in a remote external image to the image tag. So we know that this isn't going to work, but let's just show. Now, as soon as we open back up the browser, we can see that Next.js is already yelling at us that we need to actually add this as a configured host. So what we're going to do is open up our next config file, where inside here, we're going to add an images property, where inside we want to define remote patterns, which is going to be an array of objects that includes the protocol, which we want it to be HTTPS, of course, but then also our host name, where in our instance, it's going to be cdn.hashnode.com. And now as soon as the page refreshes in our browser, we can see that we now get those beautiful images rendered out into the page. So we have our full list of images and posts actually being displayed in our application with just that simple query and a little bit of magic for that image tag. Now, as one last pretty important thing for this list of posts, we want to make sure that we link to each of those posts. So if I scroll down here, and what we can do is we can first wrap our title, but we can also wrap our image with a link tag so that we're going to point them to the right spot. So we have our link component, where if I put this up inside, I can now add my href, which is going to be composed of /post, and then I can add my post.slug. But then I can do the same thing inside of my image tag, where I'm just going to simply copy and paste that to start to wrap that image. And then I'm going to close that link tag. And now once we hover over, we can see that those are created of dynamic links. But now we face one big problem is how do we actually render that page that we're dynamically creating with that slug? And here is where we're going to use dynamic page routes in order to take that slug and query our data in real time so that they get the page content related to that specific post. So going back inside the application, if I look inside of my file tree here, I actually already have a page set up for this, where again, I just have some sample content in here to help me just give a page in general. We can see that if I go to /post/post, it's literally just some sample content similar to the homepage that I'll be able to put the content in. But what we actually want to happen is the post part of this. We want this to be a dynamic value. We want it to be the slug of our post and have that render into the page. So if we look at our file tree here, the way that this is going to work is it kind of has file-based routing, but what we in particularly want is when we get to this post section, we want this to be a dynamic value, not that static post. So I'm going to rename this post value to using brackets, which designates it as a dynamic value, and let's just call that post slug. Now, of course, I don't think it matters in this instance, but I'll let it just update any imports. But now looking inside of this dynamic page, what's going to happen is inside of this function or component, it's going to pass in some parameters as an argument every time this page is actually generated as a component. Now let's type this up as well, where we're going to have our post params. I'm going to create a new interface for that. And then inside, we're going to have that params object, but inside of the params, that's where we're going to have that post slug show up, which is going to be post slug, and that's going to be a string. So ultimately, it's going to pass our post slug as an argument, as a parameter, so then we can then use that as part of our query. Now, as far as querying this data and the actual query that we're going to use to do so, I went ahead and just built this query so I don't have to spend time going through every single little piece here. But what we're going to do this time is instead of querying all the posts or, a select amount of posts as an array, we want to query a single post. And we're going to do that using the slug. So we can see under the publication, this time I'm just querying for a single post. I'm going to pass in that slug as the new argument here, but then I can query all my information on that, including the author, the content, again, the cover image, as well as the ID published at and title, which is everything I'm going to use for my post page. But now we need to add that additional slug. And if I grab one of the random ones from it, I can pass in how to detect clicks everywhere. And if I now click play and hide myself, we can see that we get all that information related to the post, including all this HTML content, which is how we're going to actually render all that content to our page. So back inside of the application, the first thing I'm going to actually do is I'm just going to copy and paste that query from the home page to start off with into my new post page. I'm going to, of course, still need to import query from @lib Hashnode, but that way it just gives a little bit of an easier starting point for me, where then I can actually just copy and paste that query itself into where the query goes here. But of course, I need to add that slug, which is going to be params.postSlug. Now, like we did before, let's console log out this publication and see what kind of data that we're actually working with. Now, if I instead go to that /post/that slug, which we saw before, and I open up my terminal here and hide myself, we can see if we scroll up all the data that's involved in actually grabbing that single post from the GraphQL API. So now let's actually render that in. So like we did before, I'm going to create a new constant called post, and this time it's going to be equal to publication, and let's do optional chaining and then post, where what we want to do is we still need to define the types for this. And since we already defined it on that home page, we don't want to have to always define them twice. So let's first abstract the types there so that we can add them to both of the files. So let's open up my navbar here. I'm going to create a new directory or inside a source called types. And this one is going to be called posts.ts. We're now back inside there. Let me grab and cut out this interface where I'm going to now export that post. So now let's just get this first one going, where I'm going to import that post type from @types posts. And we can see now that that's satisfied. It has that correct post type, just like we did before. But now let's take that same thing and let's head over to our post slug page or our dynamic route. I'm going to import that same post, but now we can see that we're not actually using it. So now let's say we're going to grab that publication post as post. Now, if I collapse the sidebar there, we can see that I'm actually having a problem with post, and that's because I'm actually using that post 2 times, one for the type and one for the component that creates the page itself. Now, an easy fix for this, I'm just going to rename the post page to post page, as that really doesn't matter. It's not really consequential for the application. So that avoids that conflict, and I can still import that post as is rather than trying to create a confusing name for it. But now we have our post, and it's going to be correctly typed out as our post, where I think the only thing is it's missing some information here, particularly the content and the author, where the rest should be filled in. So let's move that over as well under our post. And for most of these, similarly, they should be strings. So we have our author name as a string, profile picture, we have our media links. I'm going to add that colon there. The HTML is going to be a string, of course, our author. And I think that should be all pretty good to go for us to now try to test this out and fill it in. So let's start to use this post data and actually fill out the page, where starting off, let's add that post title. It's going to add post.title, and we can add our other information. We're the author. Let me hide myself, or let's just clap this. It's going to be the author, and what is that? The author dot post.author dot name. We can see that we have a link here that's going to be post.author.socialmedialinks/Twitter, post.author.socialmedialinks.Twitter, or rather, I think I want the word Twitter there, only that's going to be the link. So I'm going to replace the link with that Twitter, make sure that that's properly formatted. But then we can also add the content, where here we're going to dangerously render. So dangerously set inner HTML, where that of course should only be used if you know the content that's coming in, where CMS, that's pretty likely that you know that that's coming in from a safe place. If you have authors in here that you don't know, you probably should do some parsing, or rather sanitization, just to make sure people aren't passing anything that they shouldn't be through here. But now I'm going to pass in the HTML parameter, where we can post the post.content.html. Now, if I head back to the site, we can see that I have all that content rendered. I still have a few things missing that I need to fix, including, looks like I didn't add the right Twitter word for that link. We need to add that image instead of the placeholder here, but we can see we got the title, we even have my name, we have all the content rendered inside, and we just have a little bit of cleanup to do. So now let's finish that off. We have our first image, which is going to be the sidebar image, which we can use as our cover image. So I'm going to replace this source as post cover image .url. I think it's a URL, yep, cover image URL. Then we can also get the author image, which is going to be post author profile picture. So we can replace that source with post author.profile picture. And then we want to make sure we update that link to Twitter. And we can see that I got my profile picture in here. I even updated the word Twitter. If we look on the right here, we can see that we got that nice cover image showing. And really that can go wherever you want on the page. You can now customize and build this to your unique website and application for showing your blog post. The nice thing is we can now query that information or that everything from the Hashnode content platform and really develop the experience that we want to. So what's next? Well, we have our posts. How about some pages? What if I want to create a static page such as this link here, which is just currently a link? What if I wanted to add something like an about page? Or in my instance, since I develop courses, what if I want to add a page for courses? So just to kind of see what this actually looks like inside of Hashnode, if I go down inside of my settings here, we can see that we have that pages tab where this is going to be where I create and manage and add those pages. Where I have this courses page, which I filled out with all my different content. We can see the actual page itself, which is just a pretty static example. I add all my information. I have the links to all of my different courses, but now I want to be able to pull that in to my own site. Now this again is going to work just the same as we did for our dynamic post page, where now I can query the static pages on my publication and I can pass in the slug, such as courses here, so that I can get all the information that's relevant for that particular page. And we can see here in the right for the results, it's the same thing. I get all my content, I get all the information. You can see I even get some SEO description, which we'll cover in a little bit, but then I get my slug, my title, and everything that I need to actually render that page. So let's actually start to pull that into the application. Now to make things easier, I'm going to pretty shamelessly just copy and paste the same thing that I did for the post, but this time it's going to be, let's open my navbar, it's going to be for the page. So I'm going to first copy and paste that query, but as you remember from inside of our post, we need to make this a dynamic route because currently it's just a static route. It's just /page. So let's first make this rename page slug, which is going to make it dynamic. And then of course we can then start to add those parameters just like we did for the post. So if we remember with post, and I'm going to just copy and paste these same things, we have our post params, which is going to be that structured params. And I'm going to now do the same thing. I'm going to make sure that since we are, well, we're probably not going to abstract the page types here. So I'm just going to make that page for now. But we can see that we have our page params. Let's add our page params, and that's going to define the same thing, but this time it's going to be our page slug, which we can take and we're going to be able to pass it in directly to that query, just like we did before. Where the only thing we need to do now is we need to first import that query. So import query from @lib hashnode, and then we need to actually update the query itself. So let's copy that. I'm going to copy that same publication static page query, and I'm going to paste it right inside of where the query goes. And now let's, as usual, console log out this publication data just to make sure that we're on the right path. So back into the application, I'm going to want mine available as /courses. So if I go to /courses, we can see that it's going to try to create that page, but of course I haven't rendered anything out yet. But let's look in the terminal, where as we'd probably expect, I can now see all that information, including the title, and I can have all my HTML content here that I can now render dangerously. So I'm going to start filling all that stuff in. The first thing I'm going to do as usual, I'm going to create my page constant, which is going to be publication.static page. Let's make that a optional chaining as well. We're going to need to create our interface of page. And since we don't have two instances of it, let's not get ahead of ourselves and try to abstract that out yet. But now let me grab all that information that's going to be in the type, paste this in here. Like usual, we have all of our different strings that we're going to use. I'm going to add the colons to clean this up. And we should have that page. So we can now set this as page. So this is good to go. Let's start actually filling in the content. So I have my page. It's going to be my page.title. And we have the content, which is going to just simply be where I'm going to dangerously set inner HTML again. It's going to be HTML, and it's going to be my page content.html. And we can see, simple as that, I have all my page content in here and it looks pretty good. I'm using Tailwind typography to format this. But generally speaking, it rendered it exactly how I had it inside of my Hashnode dashboard. So this is working pretty well. But now for this course page, I want somebody to be able to actually find it. I don't have it linked anywhere. I can navigate around, including my blog, but how can somebody actually get to that course page? Well, the nice thing is not only can I manage my pages, my posts and everything, I can actually manage things like the navigation links inside of my Hashnode project. Back inside of my Hashnode dashboard, if I scroll down here, we can find the nav bar. And we can already see that I have some things here. We can either add a page or we can add a link, where a page is basically just going to be a reference to a page that we created inside of our Hashnode account, where of course we created our courses. Where a link is going to be any kind of external link that I want to post here, where what if I'm going to always maintain my store outside of this platform, so I can always direct people to that store with a simple HTTPS link. Now, as you'd probably expect, this is going to look very similar to all of the queries that we had before, but this time we're going to reference the preferences. We're also going to grab the title, where not only can we manage the navigation, we can just use the site blog name in order to fill out the top left of the blog here. So let's get the title, we can get the preferences. I'm going to click play here, and we can see that we get those navbar items exactly how they showed up in our navbar, and we get our simple title, which we can use inside of the blog. So this time inside of our app, we're going to work out of the navigation component. Again, a nice thing with server components is that we can make these queries right in the component. So we don't have to try to think about all the different places where we have to load this information. We can just render it or query it right inside the component that's going to use it. And the nice thing is Next.js, if we want to use that in multiple places, will deduplicate that request for us. So let's go into the navigation here, and I'm going to close the sidebar, but I'm going to grab that same query from one of our other posts, just so that I don't have to keep doing that myself. I'm going to also import query from @lib hashnode, but then we can now update this query like we usually do. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this publication preferences query. We're inside. I'm going to go ahead and paste it in. We're going to use that same host so we can keep that as is. But now let's start to grab the information from this, where from the publication, we're going to have our title, and we're going to have our, our preferences, and that's going to be destructured from publication. Now for the title, we should be able to just copy and paste that and add that right inside of that link, which is going to be that homepage link. We can already see inside of the application that updated to Space Jelly. So now let's render out those nav items. Now for this, I'm going to actually have to type it out. So let's start off our interface of publication. We can add that as publication, but we're going to have our title, which is going to be a string. And then let's grab all these preferences, which we can add the colons there, because it's going to be a similar data structure to what we can copy and paste from the query itself. And we can see that that's all nice and typed out now. Now from the preferences, I'm going to go ahead and just destructure navbar items, as that's just going to make it a little bit easier to work with. But now we can take for the navbar items, where that's actually going to be an array. So let me first make that array of that navbar item, where we're going to have our navbar items. So now let's start to map through that. For each item, I'm going to ultimately return one of these list items. And inside, I'm going to first add my item.label. I'm going to add a key to keep React happy with item.id. And then we can start to add the link for wherever that's going to go. And for the most part, I'm going to want this to be internal links. So we're going to make sure that we have that client-side navigation. So let's add our href of item.url. Now, if we head back to the page, and I don't think I'm covering it, but just to make sure, we can see we have our courses and we have our store. And if we hover over, we can see the different locations that they go to. Now, if I click courses, we can see that it actually takes us to Hashnode right now. And we'll handle that in a second. But if I click store, it does take me to the actual URL that I added in there. Now, as far as courses is concerned, if we look inside of here, we can see that what it's actually rendering is the entire, it's including the host in the URL rather. So what we only want is that path, so that when Next.js kicks in, it knows to render that as client-side navigation. So what we can do is we can simply just strip the host from that. But here inside of where I have my item URL, I'm going to add a replace method here. I'm going to add HTTPS. Let's hide myself, space jelly.hashnode.dev, and I'm just going to replace that with simply nothing, because what that's going to do is it's going to say, if I have all this with the path, it's going to just render the path. Now, if it doesn't have that in the URL, it's just not going to do anything. But now if I go back to the app and I can see my courses page here, and if I click it, it goes to the course's page using that client-side navigation exactly how I wanted. To take that one step further, that also includes things that you might not actually see directly on the page, or rather it's the metadata that's going to get rendered, including a description and the SEO title that you can see things inside like the Google search results page. So to see how this works, we're going to use our post page as an example here, where we're going to export a new async function called generate metadata, where inside of this is ultimately where we're going to return all the metadata that we create. Now, this is going to similarly to our actual post page itself, it's going to take these params. So I can actually just copy and paste this as is. And as you would expect, this params object will just similarly include that post slug, which we can use to query our data. And what I'm going to actually do is I'm just going to simply copy and paste this post query directly into this generate metadata. And I'm not going to do it here, but you'd probably want to abstract this inside of a function or something so that you can call the same thing in both. You don't have to copy and paste that code. But what's actually going to happen on the back end is Next.js is going to deduplicate those requests. So you're not actually going to be making the same request each time unless you change something like the query, at which point you probably would be having those same requests. Just the way that the caching mechanism actually is working. But we can see here that we now get that publication information, and we can now take that post, but now we can fill things out like our title, where we can say, let's add our post.title, and I can tag on my space jelly, and technically I can also query my publication information for this here if I wanted to fill that out. But then I can also add my description, which I don't have the information for this yet, but we can query SEO data from Hashnode. If I actually look inside one of my posts, I'm going to hide myself here. We can look at this little option here where I can find my article settings, where we can see that I get things like my open graph image, I can get the SEO title and description, and these are options that I can put in to customize how this actually appears inside of the Google search results page. So if I wanted to do something like, I'm just going to copy this, paste it in, we can't get the full thing, but I'm just going to do this as an example. So I'm going to hit update. But now if we head over to our playground, and I already copied and pasted my post query in here, but what we additionally get is we get this SEO field where we can query the title and the description. And if I can click play, we can see that I get that title and description value just as we'd expect. So inside of my query, I'm going to go ahead and add that SEO, which is going to be my description. Since we only filled in the description there, I'm going to grab that same thing and add it to my other query. And we can talk about Next.js request caching in another video. But for now, let's just add those in both of them. And then once I actually get to my post, I think I need to add the type for post as well, where we can see that I already hadn't added it before this. So I have a SEO description, but we can see now I can add my post.seo.description. But if I actually open up the browser and start to look in the elements panel, where if I hide myself, I can now search for description, where not only can I see that description, I can also see the title dynamically generated from what I just passed into it. So this is a great way to customize this to making sure that we're making it as engaging as we can inside of the search engine results page. Now, this is really just scratching the surface of what we can do. We can even create a newsletter so that we can manage that and have signups directly from that application. We also have analytics that are built into Hashnode, but we need to make sure that we figure out a way to actually send that from our site, since that's not connected as it was before when we were publishing the site directly on Hashnode itself. But there's so many different features that we can bake into this to really create as rich of an experience on our own custom blog as we want. Now, just as a reminder, if you want to actually get a full batteries included starter kit, they have that available, and you can find the link on that Headless Hashnode page. But whether you want to build your own, or you want to use this as a reference example, or just get started right away with this specific starter kit, it's a great way to have all that information in one place. Now that we have full control over the UX, let's make it easier for people to share our content by popping up a little tooltip whenever somebody selects some text inside of our site.